So why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you so much for joining us for our Chat with an Expert, Best Practices for Implementing a Research Administration System webinar. You actually have the benefit of two experts today, so double the expertise. We'll go ahead and get started. A little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. First of all, as you might have noticed, this session is being recorded. This will be available on demand after we're done here today. If you want to watch it again, or if you'd like to mention it to a colleague, they will need to register, but then they can watch the webinar on demand. All of our attendees are on mute, but that doesn't mean we don't want your questions. We certainly want your questions. Please feel free to drop them in the Q&A if you've got questions at any point, and we'll get to them just as soon as we can. Okay, with that, why don't we get started? Before I even introduce my fabulous colleagues and panelists, I want to just tell you a little bit about Kuali in case this is your first time with us on a webinar, if you're hearing about us for the first time. At Kuali, we make amazing software for higher education. And the way we do that is rooted in the history of community and partnership that goes back to the founding of the Kuali project, all the way back in 2004. At that time, a small group of colleges and universities got together, pooled their resources to solve two problems that they were facing acutely at that time. The first one was poorly designed administrative software that was built for the corporate market, or in other ways just wasn't well designed, wasn't a great fit for their needs. The second problem was relationships with vendors that didn't feel like partnerships. So in the spirit of solving those two problems and finding a new path, a small group of schools pooled their resources and began to build administrative software with the mindset of by higher education for higher education. As a decade moved forward, a community grew around the use and adoption of that software. But as the decade moved forward, it also became clear that the industry was changing and that software as a service, SaaS delivery, was moving kind of to the forefront of how schools wanted to buy and consume software. So a new model was needed. So in 2014, the foundation actually invested in a private company, Kuali, which is the company that my colleagues and I work for. Today, Kuali is a thriving, modern software as a service company. We're fully responsible for the design, development, delivery, that's the right order, of the software. But we've carried with us that spirit of community and partnership that was such a part of the founding of the Kuali project. Since 2014, we've grown considerably, just a sampling of the schools and colleges, universities and colleges using our software today. And that is across 5 product lines. We've got 5 product lines at Kuali. We have redesigned many of them. We've got great new versions of many of them on our brand new innovative platform, including research. And of course, we're here today to talk about implementations, not our software. But I did just want to give you that overview and mention a couple of things that we take great pride in when it comes to our software development and delivery. The first thing is that our software is mobile friendly. We understand that people are reviewing and approving proposals on the go on a mobile device, that faculty need to be able to access software when they're out at a research site or kind of off campus. So we care a lot about mobile first development. Our software is uniquely easy to use. We really think it's a next level of easy to use, which is exciting. It's accessible so that everyone on campus can make use of our software, not just some people. And then in terms of how we deliver software, we practice continuous delivery. That means we ship new features and functionality when they're ready to go, when they're tested and ready for our customers to assess and activate. We don't save them up for a big annual upgrade or kind of an expensive, time-consuming semi-annual process. You're always on the latest version of our software. And finally, we're proud of our zero bug policy. That doesn't mean there is never a bug. Unfortunately, no software is bug-free. But what it does mean is that when we find a bug, we stop and fix it before we move on to building new features. So we keep our bug count very low, resulting in a better experience for our customers. Okay, thanks for indulging me in my sharing a bit about the company with you. Now, let's dive into what we're here to talk about today, which is implementing research systems. And really, we are going to talk about this in a very general way. It's not going to be unique to Kuali software at all. Really, we want to share some best practices based on our experience implementing research systems. So wherever you are in your research administration system journey, we hope you'll find something of interest. Okay. Let me turn to my fabulous co-host panelists and ask the two of you to introduce yourselves. Kat, would you go first? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your role here at Kuali.
Sure, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Szulc. I'm the Director of Professional Services at Kuali. So really, my role entails sort of a couple of things. One of them is leading a team of implementation consultants that specialize in implementing Kuali products. So my entire team is in-house. We're all Kuali employees. And then I also play an individual contributor role on a number of projects. So I get to sort of experience firsthand implementations myself. I have over 10 years of leadership experience in ERP implementations and close to 18 years of experience in research administration and compliance. And I've been with Kuali for close to 8 years. Prior to joining Kuali, I have worked at universities and hospitals, sort of my experience being in research administration in those spaces. And through sort of my career, I've had the opportunity to work with many institutions, many customers, implementing the Kuali research software.
Thanks, Kat. I appreciate it. Terry, how about you?
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Terry Durkin. I am the Vice President for Customer Success here at Kuali, and that means that I have the pleasure of working with our customers throughout their entire life cycle with us. I'm responsible for our support teams. I have the pleasure of working with Kat and our professional services teams, account management, and what we call a customer success engineer, which is a specialized role that helps our customers with the technical aspects of their implementations or technical support issues. A lot of integrations, data migrations, things like that, which are probably topics that we'll cover today. Our team is great. I love every opportunity I get to talk about just the wonderful people that I get to work with. We have across our support and implementation, professional services and customer success engineers, our team average is over 9 years of working directly in higher ed at higher ed institutions, and our average is 7 years of working for ed tech companies. My own background began at university, where I spent 15 years working, a lot of that time with Kuali software. And in 2014, as Casey mentioned, when the company formed, I took the jump into this side of things. So I'm excited to be here.
Amazing. Thanks so much. I'd love to know how many implementations each of you has worked on in the past. Kat, do you have any idea how many?
I think it's probably a little over 30 implementation projects of various sizes and scopes. And there's been a lot more projects that sort of I provided oversight into, or maybe just a smaller contributor role. But sort of in terms of leading, I would say probably over 30. And it covers a wide range of institutions, universities, research hospitals, higher ed institutions, sort of small, large. So sort of have experience with sort of all various different aspects of implementations.
Okay. Wow. Thanks, Kat. How about you, Terry?
I haven't counted, but I'm pretty sure I don't have enough fingers and toes to get to that number. I'm probably in the same range as Kat in the 2 to 3 dozen in terms of being an active day-to-day contributor on different projects, and then certainly. In my current role, I get to interact with most of our customers, or pretty much all of our customers, from time to time, and that is over 200 right now, and it's fun.
Thanks, Terry. Well, I asked you that just to demonstrate when we say experts, we mean it. Thanks for your collective expertise. Okay, why don't we dive in? So one of the things that's been on my mind when I was thinking about this topic is that often a successful implementation actually begins before a project kicks off. At least that's my perspective, and I wonder if you would agree. Sometimes it begins as early as the vendor selection process, whether that's happening through an RFP process or something a little bit less formal, but no less important. So, Kat, a question for you. What are some of the things that folks should keep in mind or be asking about or thinking about when it comes to the vendor selection process in order to set the stage for a successful implementation? And I've got a couple of topics kind of here that I think are interrelated.
Yeah, and Casey, I think I would completely agree that, the process does start before you actually select a vendor or even develop an RFP that you want vendors respond to. And I think it's very important to involve the right stakeholders from the very beginning, those people who will understand what your needs are, what are you trying to accomplish with, implementing a new system and having clear objectives and clear goals defined. And then there are some of the questions that I, would often recommend institutions consider, such as, are you looking for a turnkey solution, or are you looking for something where you want that solution to adapt to what your specific needs are, right? Like, do you want something where you just flip a switch and it's ready for you to use and you have no problem adapting to it? Or is it the opposite, where you want something that's more configurable, that's really going to mold into how you envision doing business in the future? Some other things that I think are important to consider is sort of, what are you resourcing? Like, do you have a PMO office, a project management office, or will you want the vendor to sort of fill that gap? I think those are, important considerations to keep in mind. Also, I think this is a big one. Probably the next two items are big is, do you want the systems to integrate with other systems on campus? Because I think that will then drive scope of the project. And then same thing with data migration. Do you envision migrating data into the new system, or are you just looking for something where you're just going to start using from day one and not necessarily worry about the legacy data? I think identifying those key points, early on will help you sort of have, whether you're developing an RFP or whether you're just chatting with vendors, will help you have more meaningful conversation with the vendors. And then I think in turn, what's going to happen is the vendors will be able to provide more tailored responses to you, right? Because projects that are just, you're looking for a turnkey solution without any migrations, without any integrations, those are a lot smaller projects than those that include those components, right? So having clarity early on will ensure that the responses you're getting from the vendors are tailored to what you're looking for, and that you don't see surprises once the contract is signed. You won't see, oh, you want data migration, then that's, 2 more months added to the timeline that we've given you, or, X number of dollars more. So I think the more you can define early on in the process, the better your selection process will be. And sort of the timelines, the estimates you're getting from your vendors will have a lot more confidence in them than, without having those sort of questions answered early on.
Okay, that makes sense, Kat. Thanks. I've got a follow-up question for you. And Terry, don't worry, I've got some technical questions for you as well. But my follow-up question really has to do with governance. So I know that sometimes we've seen universities have a formal governance process that they sort of put in place even prior to the start of a project at vendor selection. Sometimes it's less formal. But who do you think are sort of the key stakeholders that really need to be involved, whether it's formal, informal? Who should really be at the table from the very start of the project when we're talking about research administration implementations?
Sure, yeah. And yeah, I can talk about it from the perspective of what we would usually see from sort of the institution side and then the vendor side. I think from the vendor side, I'll answer that first, because that's probably the quickest and sort of pretty standard what we would see. There would usually be someone, that wears the project manager hat, right? And someone who's the functional consultant, implementation consultant. There are instances where that person is the same resource, just wearing multiple hats, but there are certainly instances, depending on the project scope, where those are two distinct resources, right? There is someone who's really just the project manager, making sure people are delivering on task, managing tasks, developing the project plan, and so forth. And then having that implementation consultant who's really the expert of the system. And usually that person should also have subject matter expertise in the domain that's being implemented, right? So if you're implementing a research administration system, from the vendor side, it shouldn't just be an expert in how the software works. It should also be someone who's familiar with the research administration space and can advise you on best practices. And then again, from the vendor side, we also typically would see someone, a technical resource. So I know Terry will speak to it a little bit more later on, but an engineer, right? Someone who can talk about integrations and someone who can help institutions with integrations, and same thing with data migrations. So you would typically see a person in that role from the vendor side as well. And then on the customer side, or sort of on the institution side, it could vary, right? Casey, as you mentioned, sometimes there are those projects where there is a very defined project structure, governance structure, right? Where we have sponsors, and then we have the project leads, and we have project managers, and we have subject matter experts, we have business analysts, right? So it all depends sort of on the scope of the project. But I think if we just sort of take this into sort of really the resources that are necessary, right? What makes a project successful, what those resources would be, we would typically see there needs to be a project lead. And whether that project lead also is a PM or is the subject matter expert, that depends, right? We've certainly seen and had projects be successful where there's just the one project lead and that person is also the subject matter expert of the domain that we're implementing. If the institution does not have a defined project management structure, or PMO office, or a project manager that they can assign, I think it's important to identify that and let the vendor know, because oftentimes the vendor could help with that and they can sort of manage the entire project for the institution. And then oftentimes trainers might be needed. So if the project will include a big training component, you might need to have someone who will wear the trainer hat. And then once you're live with the system, you might need to identify someone who's going to support that system, right? Be that sort of expert of the system that you've implemented. So if your users have any questions, there is a resource that they can reach out to. But again, sometimes it's fluid on the institution side. And I think the point I want to drive to is that your vendor should be flexible enough to work with you, right? And help you identify and fill the gaps if there are any. So if there's some, project role gaps that we've identified and you don't have resources, again, working with your vendor to see how those gaps can be filled.
Okay, thanks, Kat. And we sort of jumped a little bit ahead into some of the topics that often come up at the very first stage of a project. So, we've talked a little bit about how these considerations are important to start thinking about even during the vendor selection process. So you have a chance to talk with various vendors or your chosen vendor about how they will help you and support you. Okay, makes sense. Let's jump ahead in time a little bit and assume you're ready to go, time to kick off the project. And we refer to that sort of very initial planning stage as startup. It's got different names, but surely any project has kind of a similar time period or stage. So we've talked a little bit about key project stakeholders. You've mentioned, a project lead, subject matter experts, technical folks. Who else besides the immediate product team needs to be in the conversation? And Kat, I'll turn to you one more time to talk about that functionally. And then Terry, I'm going to be interested in your perspective technically. I mean, if we're thinking broadly, who needs to at least be considered and at the table?
So I think very initially, right, when we're kicking off the project, we want to identify all the stakeholders. So I think what I've talked about was that immediate project team, but the software you're implementing could potentially touch many people on campus, right? Whether it's the department administrators, whether it's faculty. So it's going to be important to identify who needs to be in the know, right? Who are the stakeholders? And, when do we need to start pulling those stakeholders into the project, right? Maybe we're going to have a UAT phase where we want to open it up to the department administrators, right? So that they can help us test during that phase. So we'll want to sort of do that as part of the startup of the project, is to identify all of those things. And in the past implementations, we've seen department administrators be a pretty significant stakeholder in the project. Definitely faculty when it comes to certifying, approving, maybe even creating proposals. There might also be folks in your accounting office, your financial office, right? Especially if we're talking about integrations, right? We may need to pull those folks in if the financial integrations is in scope. So I think once the scope of the project is defined, that then helps you identify who are all of the individuals that will need to be pulled into the project at one point or another, or even those individuals that will need to be in the know of what's happening with the project, because the project will sort of impact them at some point. So that would be sort of the typical folks that we would see, or roles, I guess I should say, that we would see being impacted.
Thanks, Kat. That makes sense. And Terry, who are the stakeholders? And I can tell you're already going to jump in, so thank you on the technical side.
Yeah. Well, before I answer the question about the technical side, I guess I would just summarize a lot of what happens in the startup phase is really preparing for the overall change management as well. So who are the folks that will eventually need to be trained, communicated with, all of those things. You want to have an idea of who they are up front and really determine, and it can vary per project, but have an idea of when you want to engage those different folks as stakeholders. Now, on the technical side, again, like a lot of what we've already talked about, it is going to be a little bit dependent on the goals of the project and what the overall scope and what the overall needs of the institution are. Baseline, you should be talking to a vendor who is able to at least work with your single sign-on and support your two-factor authentication and make sure that everything is good with your identity and your security team from that point of view. From there, it's really going to depend on what you want to accomplish with the project. Now, most of the systems, if you have an idea about the systems that you would like to eventually integrate with as part of the project, that is another thing that should be identified early on, and probably even before vendor selection, to make sure you're working with someone who has a track record and is able to work with the systems that you want to work with. And then it really depends on the team and the campus structure for who those actual individuals will be. They may be people coming out of a central IT organization. They may be people who have an expertise in certain areas of the institution or other systems that you would like to integrate with, or they may even be from the research office itself if you're staffed with a research IT team as well. So just to summarize, those are the skills that we're looking for, the people who can put the pieces together and think about how the systems need to integrate, and the individuals may come from various places on campus.
Thanks, Terry. Follow-up question for you. What happens if you're a research administration shop trying to move forward with implementing a system and you really don't have, maybe it's not that you don't have buy-in from IT, but maybe IT is too busy with too many other projects. They can't really help, or they can't help much. Can you still be successful? There's still a path forward.
Yeah, there's always a path forward. It should be part of your vendor's job to help you find out what that path forward is, and having a sense of whether that's going to be a challenge to the project going into the project would help set up some of those conversations that you might want to have, and make sure that the vendor that you're selecting does have an easy path to build an integration. So at least if you can say, this is the scope and this is the amount of effort that it will take to integrate, and that's backed up by experience, because those folks have worked with other customers before, that eases the conversation with the central IT organization as well. The integration also depends on when you want to begin using that. We can also phase a project, so the items that don't require a deep integration with other systems on campus, may be able to go live as you're waiting for those IT resources to become available, or we can find other ways to make sure that we're achieving those goals as part of the project.
Okay, thanks, Terry. One final question about the startup phase, and then we can kind of move into the heart of the project. Establishing project norms. So how will we communicate? When will we meet? What mechanisms will we use to communicate with one another? Kat, can you talk a little bit about what you've seen be successful there? And I think related to that, do we have to be co-located? Do we have to be geographically working together in order to be successful?
Yeah, I think communication is key to a successful project. Some of the things that we've seen and some of the things that we practice is having regular check-in meetings, whether they're weekly, bi-weekly, deciding on what the right cadence is, but there has to be a regular check-in that happens. Uh, um, and that often helps keep the project sort of moving on task. Also using collaborative tools, right? What you've asked about being co-located, our work landscape has changed significantly, right? Kuali has been a remote team way before COVID pandemic hit, but a lot of our customers haven't, right? For a lot of our customers, being remote is new, and that sort of has become the standard now for a lot of the work that we do. And even before that, we all of our implementations or most of our implementations have been remote. So when remote implementation is sort of at play, because that's sort of the standard that sort of we implement, and then also a lot of our customers now are remote, using collaborative tools that allow us to sort of work in real time and collaborate with one another without having to send files via email, and then making sure we're always working off of the latest version. So some of the collaborative tools that we've seen work well is, having a project management tool that's maybe something like Asana or another task management tool like that. Sharing documents or uploading documents into a shared workspace, whether it be Google Drives or SharePoint or any tools like that allow us to, again, collaborate in real time. And then communication platforms, Zoom, Teams, whatever the case may be, so that when we are on meetings, we're seeing each other, right? We don't have to be co-located, but we're seeing each other's faces, and we see who we're talking to. So those are some of the things we've seen work pretty well when implementations are remote. So even though most of the implementations are remote, I think it's important that if it's for the customer to identify, maybe it's important for the customer that there is some on-site components, right? We might still see that. We might still see that maybe there is a training component where it's really important that you have the vendor come on site. So I think it's important that you identify that early on, and you sort of communicate that as part of your vendor selection process, that, one of the things we want is we do want some face-to-face time in person. And we've certainly done that with our implementations, where if one of our customers does require that we come on site, we're happy to do that, and we're happy to deliver those tasks sort of face to face. So again, being upfront about it, also knowing that remote implementations are possible. They have been successful, at least in our experience. As successful as in-person implementations, and they're also, as you all probably suspect, cheaper than an in-person sort of implementation.
Sure.
But also understanding that making sure that the communications norms are defined early on, and that we have the tools that we need in order to support us working remotely.
Makes sense. Thanks. Well, I'm going to move on to what we often consider the initiation phase of a project. Again, these go by different names depending on the methodology or the formal or informal nature of your project. We've talked a little bit about kind of getting started. I think it might make sense to talk about phasing. So research administration systems often have multiple components, products within a suite, modules within a set of capability, and they interrelate. So pre-award, post-award, human animal use, conflict of interest, technology transfer, all kinds of different things. Does a school need to go live all at once? Is a school better off phasing or staging that? How do we think about that functionally and technically? And what are some of the considerations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's going to be one of those things where, well, it depends, right? What are we working on? What are we implementing? But I think I want to speak to it more from a perspective of sort of when a phased implementation works well versus when a big bang implementation works well. So I think a phased implementation really allows the team to manage the changes in smaller chunks, right? So maybe the institution is not able to absorb all the changes that are coming all at once, and maybe we need to roll it out in small pieces So in those cases, we have seen that a phased implementation work well. So maybe if we're implementing pre-award proposal, the proposal piece and the award piece, and maybe you want your central office to get experience with the system first before you open it up to campus. In those cases, it might make sense to roll out the award piece to the central office first as the first phase, and then roll out the sort of campus-facing modules as a second phase. So that certainly has worked in the past for us pretty well, is to phase it out. Maybe compliance modules are in scope too. And again, you don't want to do everything at once. Sometimes it makes sense to sort of break things into smaller chunks. And then the nice thing about that is we have an opportunity to learn, right, from our initial phases and apply those sort of lessons learned to later phases of the project. But certainly on the other hand, the big bang approach has also worked. And there are instances where that is the preferred approach. So for example, maybe you are replacing one system entirely with the new system that you're implementing, right? In those cases, breaking things into chunks might not make sense because you don't want to live in two systems, right? If you're replacing one with the other, it probably makes sense to just have a clean cut, and at the point in time of the go live, you just want to move everything to the new system. So in those cases, it's definitely, I think, more advantageous to just sort of do a big bang approach where you're going live with everything at once. I think ultimately the decision which approach to take is something that sort of the customer would make in consultation with the vendor, sort of knowing the entire landscape of what we're trying to do, and then deciding which approach is best. And you might not know this until you sort of get into that initiation phase of the project, right? And again, making sure that your vendor has experience with both approaches is going to be essential, because you may start with a big bang and then realize shortly thereafter that that's not the right approach. So being able to pivot quickly and adjust without much impact to the project, I think, is important. And again, you just want to make sure that the vendor you select has experience in doing that as well.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks, Kat. And these questions come up sort of right at the beginning of the project, because that's usually the point where collaboratively we're building out a project plan. We want to understand, how long is this going to take? What resources will be required and when? So thinking about a lot of these things up front can help build a more accurate and solid project plan. And so often folks ask, how long will this take? And the answer is always, well, it depends. And I think there are two key things that can impact the length and complexity of the project more than any other. And I think, Terry, these are going to be questions for you. Data migration and integration. So having a plan early on about how those things are going to be handled is critical. And we can talk about some of the details of how we actually execute on a data migration a little bit, but in terms of planning, what are some of the things people should think about? I mean, do we migrate our data? Do we not? Do we migrate at all? What do we do if our data is coming from a bunch of different systems? What if it's not clean? What if there's going to be some missing data, knowing the future state system? Can you talk a little bit about how to think some of those things through?
Yeah, absolutely. So very early on in the project, you should be thinking about those things, even if you don't have all the answers yet, but that will set you up to make decisions as you go and as you get into the execution phase of the project. Your vendor should be asking you what your source systems are, how confident you are in the data, how well the data matches the desired future state for the business process and things like that. Often there's a question about how much data do we bring over, and frequently that's sort of framed in the context of how far back do we bring data over, and really the thing that complicates the data conversion is not necessarily how far back in time do we go, but it's how much of the data are we bringing over for an individual record, and that adds to maybe ways that you have to transform the data or make it fit into the new system. Typically, what we find is by the time we know where the data is going to go in the new system and we've mapped that into the future state, the amount of data in terms of timeline in the past is less important or less critical to the overall effort of doing a data migration. So those are some of the things to think about. Having a solid idea, again, in this phase of the project around integrations is also really important. Knowing what you want to accomplish with integrations and having a sense of where the right people to involve in each of those. If you want to integrate with multiple different systems on campus for multiple different reasons, then that could be different teams. So having a general sense of that as you're going into it, or at what point in the business process of the new system do you expect integrations to work? What are the source systems? What are the destination systems? What is the system of record for different pieces of data? That's all important to be thinking about at this point, so we can effectively, build a project plan around those high level pieces and execute on those as part of the project.
Makes sense. I think sometimes if you're not in IT, you're not a technical person and you don't have a lot of experience with implementations, it can be really intimidating and really scary to think about, well, how do I know what the integration should look like? How do I know what data should be migrated? And I just want to offer, I think sometimes it's helpful to think of it in the business context. What do I need to be able to accomplish when I'm live?
Yeah.
What do I need to be able to report on? What kind of processes do I need to be able to support? What do we want to achieve from a business perspective? And then sometimes that can help you in partnership with the vendor and in partnership with IT colleagues, sort of figure out, okay, what has to happen technically is an offshoot of what needs to happen from a business perspective. Does that kind of line up with your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And really that's sort of, staying focused on what are the outcomes that we're looking for with this project, and staying focused on that aspect of it really puts a lot of information into the entire startup and initiation phase of the project. If we can stay focused on outcomes and less about individual steps that we may need to take, then that really lets your vendor shape the solution to meeting those desired outcomes in the most efficient way possible.
Okay, thanks. Kat, question for you. So I'm kind of moving along to sort of the heart of any kind of project, which we refer to as execution, but I'm sure it goes by many names. It's when you're actually doing the work to get everything set up. And so you touched on this before, but do folks have to change their business processes to make use of a new system? Should they change that? How do you know if you should change your business processes? How do you kind of think through whether or not business process change should be a part of the project?
Yeah, so I don't know that it should. I don't know that it should, but I think it's often a wise thing to consider, right? It's not. It's very common that as part of an implementation, institutions do change their business processes, and often implementing a new tool, a new software is an opportunity to revisit your business processes, right? Because you may have been doing things for a number of years just because that's how it's always been done. So introducing a new tool, a new system is often an opportunity to revisit business processes, which I think is a great idea to do as part of a project. And I think there should be a balance, right? Standardizing the processes where possible to fully take advantage of the tool you're implementing and the capabilities that are within the tool. But then also at the same time, seeing how the system can adapt to your critical business processes that maybe cannot be altered, right? So it's finding that balance of sort of seeing where we should change and want to change versus where things need to stay as they are. And always keeping in mind sort of your objectives, right? To what we were saying is think about it. What are we trying to accomplish and not necessarily this step, right? Because your vendors you should be able to understand this is what the end goal is. This is what we need to arrive to. And then be able to know how the system needs to be configured to get you to that end result. So again, working with your vendor very closely to get to that point, I think is going to be essential. But again, it's implementing a new system is a great opportunity for you to rethink your business processes and see how things can get optimized.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks. I have a question about configuration, and I'm trying to sort of think through how to ask it. I guess who's responsible for making configuration choices? Is that the vendor? Is that subject matter experts? How does that work?
Yeah, that's also a great question. And I think, configuration decisions, I think, involve a mix of stakeholders. And those stakeholders need to have an understanding of your day-to-day operations, right? Your vendor will have a general sense of what you do, how you do it, but they're not in the day-to-day. So I think it's very important to include those folks that do or are part of the day-to-day operations of the pieces of functionality or the pieces of the software that you're implementing. And then it's really with the consultation with the vendor that should guide you through making those decisions. But ultimately, it should be the team, right? The institution's team who makes those configuration decisions. And then the vendor should be there to consult and maybe talk about best practices and recommendations based on what you're trying to accomplish.
Makes sense. Thanks, Kat. Terry, could you talk a little bit about how we actually operationalize data migration? What happens? How do we make sure that the data comes over to the new system and it's complete and it's accurate? And how does that work? I'm actually going to stop sharing just so we can see each other and chat.
Sure. Thanks, Casey.
Sure.
We take an iterative approach, and I think that's very common for folks to take that iterative approach to data migration. We typically build at least 2 data migrations plus a dry run prior to go to a go live when we are working with a client on a project, and that gives us a chance to really learn about the data during the first migration. Apply what we've learned about the data in a second migration and make sure that any changes or any transformations that we're making all behave the way we expect them to with the configuration that's evolving as we've discussed, and then go into a period of a dry run where really there's no major process changes happening at that point. We want to see everything work the way we expect it to prior to go live. Our goal of a successful dry run is for someone to say, gosh, I could send the email to campus right now to say, we're live on the system, but, other people aren't ready. But that's typically how we see folks do that. And it makes sense when you think about just normalizing data from sometimes multiple disparate systems. And then in terms of who's working on the project, that's something that your vendor should also be able to help with in terms of making the data fit into the shape of the new system and doing some of that work for you, either by having tools that help with that or by having that be part of the project scope.
Okay. I just want to mention that Elizabeth put a great point in the chat. Sorry, it was in the QA. Just about how implementation should help make processes more efficient. I think that's a great point. Please feel free to share observations, thoughts, or questions in the Q&A. We'd love to hear from you as well. But we should move on because I think the 3 of us could talk about implementations forever, but I want to move us along a little bit to touch on a couple of key topics. One of them is testing. So testing is a key part of an implementation, but I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding where someone thinks, wait a minute, isn't the software supposed to work? Is it my job as a customer to actually test this software? And I think it's not. I think testing plays another role. And I wonder, Kat, if you could talk a little bit about sort of what role testing plays in the implementation process.
Yeah, thanks, Casey, for asking that, because yes, we do see that come up often. And that's correct. So the testing that you're being asked to do as part of an implementation sort of goes beyond, does the system function correctly? Because that's not customer's responsibility. That's really on the vendor to make sure that their system is functioning how it's supposed to. Really, right. When we're talking about testing as part of an implementation, is testing to make sure that the system meets your specific needs and it's configured to align with your business processes, right? So that is what we're testing, is making sure that the system works and your team is able to validate your processes using the configurations that have been applied. And that will include testing configurations, as I've said. It'll include the testing data migration, right? Because again, we want to make sure your data came over correctly and it's in the right places. We want to make sure your integrations work correctly, that you take the data out of Kuali and put it into the right places in the other system, or vice versa. Maybe there's integrations coming into Kuali. So it's really doing that end-to-end testing. You're not testing that the software is functioning correctly. You're testing that what we've configured, the integrations, the migrations are correct for your needs.
I just want
That
to
makes sense.
add on to that real quick. Sorry, before we move on, that we haven't talked a whole lot about reporting, which is sort of
Mm.
what we do at the tail end with all that data. And so that's another really important aspect of that acceptance testing, is to make sure that you're able to answer the questions that you want to answer using the data that you're putting into the system.
Yeah, thank you. That's right, because you're capturing data to process transactions for operational needs, but also so you can report on those transactions. And that's critical, especially at the intersection of data migration, configuration choices, integrations, and reporting. Yeah, thanks. Let's talk a little bit about training. So we could go much deeper on any of these topics, but I just want to kind of hit some of the key things. How do you think about training?
So I think over the last few years, we really, or at least I've seen a shift in training. It used to be, hands-on training, classroom training, a big handout with this is how you do every single step in the system. And I think a lot sort of what the need is now is to have tools out there that are self-explanatory, right? I should be able to log in and know what I need to do without having a 100-page user guide on how to do it, right?
Right,
So
right.
I think one of the things we're seeing is, leveraging as much as you can within the tool that you're implementing and providing guidance within the tool, whether it's having
Mm.
instructions embedded within questions or links embedded within questions, using tools that allow you to build out branching logic, progressive, display of fields, and sort of taking advantage of that as much as possible so that you don't have to spend time developing Zoom training sessions or, long user guides that then you have to keep updating because things are changing, right? So I think taking advantage of that as much as possible, I think is essential, and often sort of that's where I'm sort of seeing the move or the shift in training happening. Though there are still needs to have quick guides, user guides, and things like that. So we've definitely still seeing that as part of implementations to sort of develop those guides. In terms of
Mm.
training, it's really sort of, again, it's something you'll want to work with your vendor as part of the planning phase of the project, and as you also get into the execution phase of the project, is identifying what will those training needs be, who needs to be trained, and how we will deliver that training, right? So having a plan up front will then help you execute on that training strategy. And again, vendors will often provide you with sort of system specific guidance, right? That they've learned as part of implementing with you. And then the internal team at the institution will usually take this and adapt it to be sort of customer specific of what those training resources need to be. But I would definitely encourage taking advantage of the tool first and embedding as much as possible within a tool, and then sort of looking at what else is needed.
I think that's a great point, Kat. I mean, that's how we consume software today. All of us are using software in a lot of complicated ways. We're buying things, we're selling things, we're doing all of that in our non-work lives. And so the standard has changed a little bit. We shouldn't need to sit for hours in a classroom to figure out how to use the tools that we need to use at work. Yeah,
Exactly.
makes sense.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's shift to going live. So how do you prepare for go live? What does go live look like? How do you time that? What needs to happen? And maybe, Terry, I'll turn to you for this. Although certainly either of you could answer.
Yeah, so go live, it's very important to plan for go live, especially a system like a research administration system, research compliance system, or a financial system. Business doesn't stop, and you have to really be focused on minimizing the amount of time that you're cutting over. So we will often dedicate time over a weekend in order to do a final data migration and any sort of final testing or final integrations that need to happen on campus, so folks can come in on Monday morning and be using the new system. That's different than some other systems where they may be more cyclical, and going live means we're ready to support the transactions that will begin trickling in a couple weeks or a couple months. And so it's important that your vendor understands just how important that initial cutover period is, because as folks say, for the end users who are maybe experiencing the new system for the first time, that may be their first impression, and it's important that we get it right. In terms of what goes into a cutover, hopefully because we've done a dry run or because you've prepared for the cutover to go live with your vendor, it's not a lot of drama. There's not a lot of fires to put out. Things are running smoothly because we've had many opportunities to practice those things. So we may be talking about things like promoting an integration to production or changing a data source for reporting to pull from the new system versus the old system. But very little surprises. We don't like a lot of drama when it comes to actually going live. It should
No
be
drama.
as smooth as possible, and that is our goal. And certainly, it's one of the success criterias of the implementation project.
Thanks, Terry. We actually have a question that I think is a great question. And it is, could you explain the difference between configuration and customization and what implementers need to know about the difference? It's an important question because I think customization often refers to code customizations, which carries with it a lot of overhead in terms of upgrades, maintenance, whereas configuration is using the shipped functionality or the delivered functionality to meet your needs. I think we've probably got a strong point of view about that at Kuali, in that we want to help you meet your business needs without you needing to do code customizations. We want to offer kind of a configuration option. And each of you kind of quickly share your thoughts on configuration versus customization and what people need to consider when they're making that choice.
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. I think that really is a conversation to have during the vendor selection process, and that can be a cultural change on campus as well. A lot of folks who have used either homegrown systems or have worked with other vendors who have had a lot of room for customization, have found that they can often get the feature that they are wanting immediately, but that has a downside of making upgrades or things like that more different. So it's important for you to be talking to your vendor ahead of time about their point of view on customization, configuration, and extensibility. And so it's sort of the three differences there are, customization, the way we think about it is actually changing the code that is running. And in Kuali research, all of our customers are using the exact same base code, and we leverage configuration to make the products work the way that are going to help meet our customers' desired outcomes. And that's another important reason why we focus on, what are the success criteria or what are the desired outcomes, is so we can kind of steer the configuration of the system in order to best match those, so we can achieve those efficiencies the way that the way that we've been talked about and has been mentioned. And then there's also the idea of I want to use the system, or I want to use it as a jumping off point for some other process or to support some other process. And that's where integration and extensibility really come into play. And extensibility is from our point of view, more about having processes that work directly with the solution that you're implementing versus just integrating data from another system or pushing and pulling data. It's really more about having those systems work together. So understanding the story around those things is very important.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Well, I think the final topic that I want to cover, and actually probably just jump back to sharing and kind of move things ahead a little bit, is the transition to operational support. So we can't stay in implementation forever, and we can't stay in project mode forever. At a certain point, we go live, and then we've got to transition out of product mode into this is the new way that we're doing our business. Can you talk a little bit, maybe, Kat, about what that transition looks like, how we handle kind of immediate post-go live support? What are some things to think about to make that transition successful?
Yeah, of course. So immediately after go live, sort of the focus is to making sure things are stable and you're getting the support you need. So at that point, sort of we enter that sort of immediate post go live support. Sometimes we call it hypercare, where it's really, you're still with your vendor implementation team, and that team is providing support to you, and that team is answering any questions you have, any urgent issues you have. And that sort of ensures there's continuity, right? Like the people who have implemented with you and been with you on this journey are still there to provide the support because they're the most familiar with the decisions have been made, the configurations that have been applied. But then eventually, as things stabilized and you're comfortable with the system and sort of the questions die down and everyone is just going about using the system, we transition to what's called sort of that operational support. So sort of that marks the end of the project. So we're no longer in implementation. You sort of get over in our case, you get handed off to the support team that then sort of takes care of you. And, that doesn't happen until, like I said, you're stable, right? We've answered all the questions, things have been delivered, there is nothing outstanding, and we sort of transition you to that operational support. At that point, we also do sort of a formal project closure where we have a debrief meeting, or it could be a survey. Again, each vendor might handle this differently, how they want to close out a project. But it's really an opportunity for us to learn and sort of ask questions about what went well, what didn't go so well, what can we do differently the next time we do this. I mean, the next time might be phase 2 of the project, right? Because again, if you've decided to do a phased implementation, we might close out one phase and transition you to operational support for that phase of the project, but then we're starting the second phase of the project. But really at that point, you would just transition to the operational support. Depending on how the vendors are structured, many of the vendors might still have the same project team that you've implemented with, might still sort of get pulled into the support questions, right? So at least that's the case with us at Kuali. Oftentimes when there are questions our support team needs assistance with, we're there to help them, and sort of we never truly disappear.
And that's sort of the benefit of that all being in-house, that
Exactly.
the folks that you've worked with are there with you for the long term. Well,
Yep.
We're coming up on the top of the hour. Certainly, if there are any last questions, we would be delighted to take them. We do want to leave you with some positive comment from a customer. We always are happy to hear that things worked out great, that things were easier. That is what we want. We want you to feel like it was an easy process when you're working, certainly with us. Happy to take any questions. I do want to mention that we've got 2 events coming up where you can talk with us in person. One is EduCause, the big annual EdTech conference coming up. We'll also be at the Society of Research Administrators International Conference, which I believe is in Chicago this year. Absolutely delighted to chat with you in person at those events. If you're intrigued and you want to learn more either about our team, our approach to implementations, or our research software, you can either go to that URL, you can scan that QR code, it'll take you to our website where you can learn more. With that, I want to thank my fabulous panelists, co-hosts, Kat and Terry. Thanks for all your expertise. Really appreciate it. And we hope you'll keep the conversation going. Don't hesitate to be in touch with us if there's anything we can do for you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
Casey.
Oh,
Bye.
we've got, hold on. I don't want to end. We've got a question. I just want to wedge one more question in. You know what? It's actually a compliment. Thanks, Gene. Gene expressed his appreciation for the job we did. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. And take care. Goodbye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye.